my consultant on problems of mass transit. And the question of transportation in general is Theodore Kiel. I asked him some time ago, to the basis of a continuing examination he was making of the problem of funding mass transit and mass transportation in New York, to collect on a piece of paper his thinking on this subject based on the studies that he has made, and to give them to me. I announced to the public and to the press that I would encourage him to release to the public any such memorandum that he might prepare. Mr. Kiel has been ably assisted by Professor William Vickery of Columbia University, transportation and a transportation planner and an economist. And I would like to turn this meeting now over to Ted Kiel for a discussion of the report which he has today issued and which I believe has been distributed to the press.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I am pleased to submit this report to you entitled "A Balanced System of Transportation is a Must." And I was more than assisted by Professor Vickery. He has likewise prepared a report entitled "Transit Fare Increases a Costly Revenue," and has made an analysis which is the predicate for my report to the mayor, which I think is one of the most important documents I have read. It puts an entirely different perspective on the question of the fare. There is a tendency for people to speak cynically about efforts to save the fare because of its so-called political implications. What Professor Vickery has done is to establish clearly that a fare increase is one of the most costly and burdensome and inequitable ways of raising funds. For every dollar that is achieved by the public through a fare rise, there is a cost in the case of buses of $1.50 to the persons paying the fare, and a cost of $1.18 in the case of subways. That is, there will be if the fare is to go up an additional 5 cents, and more, obviously, if it was to go up 10 cents or 15 cents. The fare increase falls most heavily on the poor, or those least able to pay, and it likewise engenders additional costs in terms of added traffic congestion and air pollution, costs that are very difficult to measure but are nevertheless very real costs to the people in the city. Contrary-wise, a tax on motorists is not only equitable, because currently, as Professor Vickery demonstrates, the motorist is receiving a subsidy so far out of proportion to the subsidy given to mass transportation riders that if there were no charge for riding the buses and subways, if they were absolutely free, the cost to the public for the subsidy to motorists would be in excess of the subsidy to maintain a totally free transportation system. It is also an efficient tax because it yields at least as much as it costs, and to the extent that various types of taxes on the motorist can reduce traffic congestion, will actually cost less to the motorist than the amount of money that the public achieves. Indeed, as Professor Vickery also points out, that it's entirely possible, to the extent that there are conditions, and there are, of what he calls hypercongestion. Traffic congestion so great that if it is reduced, it is possible to move cars more rapidly in a given period of time than you can in a condition of hypercongestion with the additional cars. Move cars and people, that to the extent that you can alleviate hypercongestion, there can be little or even no cost to the motorist. And it's upon these important findings that I base my recommendations to you, Mr. Mayor, that there should be introduced a variety of taxes and tolls on the motorist to be used most immediately to save the 20-cent fare and also to form the basis for an approach to the problems of mass transportation in conjunction with, of course, a federal law legislation establishing a transportation trust fund, but by action that can be taken by the state of New York and the city of New York that will put us on the road to what is a must, a balanced system of transportation, and the development of a transportation policy ultimately in the form of a tri-state agency with power-making and decision-making authority over all agencies of transportation, including in particular the Port of New York Authority, with regard to the best and most efficient way to move people and goods in the metropolitan area. The particular taxes proposed, Mr. Mayor, are set forth at the outset of this report and again in a summary. Yes, I think perhaps you might like to hear from Professor Vickery on the conclusions reached in his report.
Well, I think I can just summarize very briefly as Ted Keel just said, every time you raise the fare, before the city can get any net revenue out of this, or the Transit Authority for that matter, some of the money that the people pay, the extra nickel that the people who remain on the system pay, will have to go to make good the revenue lost by the people who no longer ride. Out of 1,000 riders who now pay 20 cents for bus fares for a total of $200, I estimate that about 929 would continue to ride after the fare increase and pay a total of $232.25, so that there would be a net revenue of $32.25. But each of these riders would be paying 5 cents more, so that in total they are paying $46.45 more than before. And in addition, those who no longer ride are doing something that they may prefer to riding at 25 cents, but which is not as satisfactory to them as the 20-cent ride. So they are worse off by about $1.77 on the whole. And so, according to these estimates, it costs the riders $48.22 to secure $32.25 of net revenues to the city, or in effect, at the rate of $1.50 of burden on the riders for every dollar that the city gets. The situation on the subway is not quite so bad. I estimate that in that case, the ratio is about $1.18 for each dollar that the city would secure. Ordinarily, one might think that there was something of an offset to be expected in the way of improved riding conditions or possibly savings in cost to the Transit Authority. But experience has shown that when the fare goes up, it is chiefly the people who make short trips, it is chiefly the people who make trips in the off-peak hours or on the outlying segments of the system that drop off. And there is little or nothing that can be done to lower the operating costs as a result of such riding. Indeed, if the Transit Authority did do this, I think I can estimate roughly that for every dollar that the Transit Authority would save in reduced operating expenses by cutting back on the service because of there are fewer riders, the riding public would pay 2 or 3 times this much in terms of added waiting time on the subway platforms. there are other ways in which the city can raise revenue. Even the sales tax, which I regard as the worst possible alternative, is better than the transit fare. I perhaps should explain a little bit further what is meant by what I call hypercongestion. Very often, one gets so many cars on the street that the movement is so slow that even with more cars on the street at one time, they are moving so slowly that the actual production of useful transportation in terms of vehicle miles is less than what it would be if there were actually fewer cars on the street. And by controlling through appropriate charges the number of cars on the street, you can actually improve conditions to the point where you are getting more traffic and getting better service. And in many cases, the motorist will be better off paying the charges and getting somewhere in a reasonable length of time than he would now. In particular, if you would be able perhaps to get across town in 10 or 15 minutes for a price, which is something that nobody can do now at any price, unless perhaps you can get a helicopter to do it for him, and that's not very practical. Immediately, we are faced with the problem that the types of charges that are available for immediate implementation are perhaps not the best. This is something that will have to be studied and worked out over a period of years. We can look forward to something very much better than the immediate program than Ted Keel has presented, but this is going to take time.
Thank you. I'd like to respond very briefly to what Mr. Keel and Professor Vickery have recommended. Theodore Keel's report is an important contribution to public discussion of transportation policy and transportation finance. I agree with him that automobiles are strangling our cities and that comfortable, convenient, and cheap mass transit is vital if our cities are to survive. I agree with him also that the 20-cent subway fare is crucial to New York City, to its welfare, and that everything that can be done to save that fare should be done. Specifically, Ted Keel's suggested tax program is the most constructive contribution. As the Keel report shows, subway and bus riders are discriminated against by New York state laws which favor the automobile. Additional taxes imposed on automobile use to benefit mass transit would begin to correct this inequity. The Keel program could make unnecessary the fare increases now being sought on the New Haven Railroad, could benefit riders on the Long Island Railroad, and could help bus riders all over the state, all in addition to keeping down the fare on our subways. In the days ahead, I will be talking about this program with legislative leaders from the city and upstate, with other mayors and county executives, and with the governor. I know that Chairman Ronan of the MTA will welcome these proposals and consider them carefully. He is convinced, as I am, that low-cost and comfortable mass transit on consumer railroads, as well as on the city buses and subways, is essential. Governor Rockefeller will have to play an important role because the subways are now operated by the state. In the recent excitement over service on the Long Island Railroad, the governor recognized that the state takeover of that railroad made him ultimately responsible for service. The subways are also state-run, and I'm sure that the governor will now play a helpful role in our efforts to hold the fare.
Mr. Keel, could you review for us just what the proposals are?
Yes. These are emergency proposals to deal with the crisis we face at the moment. First, I propose increasing the tolls on bridges and tunnels operated by the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority and the Port Authority. Doubling the tolls on the TBTA would bring in an additional $25 million a year. In the case of the Port Authority, it would bring in an additional $70 million a year, which of course would have to be shared with New Jersey, something that I've tried to make clear and the Port Authority continues conveniently to overlook. Second, increase registration fees for New York vehicles. An average increment of $20 would yield $135 million for a mass transportation fund. Third, increase the gasoline tax by 1 cent a gallon to produce $35 to $50 million. Fourth, impose a levy on charges in parking lots and on garages in New York City to raise $15 million a year. Hopefully, this should be done, if it is administratively possible and legally possible, on parking lots and garages in congested areas so as to relieve the conditions of hypercongestion which we've discussed. Fifth, which is a long-term proposal, initiate a tri-state approach with an agency vested with policy-making power over all forms and agencies of transportation.
These proposals would be fair to the people who drive their cars into New York City.
Yes, I do.
What these proposals?
I do support these proposals. I think this is a very well worked out plan which can save the 20-cent fare. As Mr. Keel and Professor Vickery have stated, the motorist is heavily subsidized today, very heavily subsidized by public monies. And the program that is suggested by Mr. Keel here places a very, very small tax on the automobile in order to assist the automobile rider as well as the mass transit rider, because it will tend to reduce congestion on the highways and on the roads. Even with the Keel proposal here in effect, the automobile and the automobile driver still comes out ahead because he still receives by far the greater proportion of subsidy under current arrangements in this country.
See, this is a penny gasoline tax across the state or just in the cities?
No. Statewide. This is a statewide proposal which Theodore Keel has put together, designed to assist the commuter and the upstate mass transit rider, the bus rider, as well as the strap hangers in New York City.
Think that the upstate drivers would want to pay a cent a gallon on their gasoline?
Well, there would be an appropriate allocation of the monies to upstate mass transit riders. And the condition that we find in New York, while extremely severe because of the largeness of our city and the largeness of the metropolitan district, is not unique to New York City.
Mr. Keel, our quick arithmetic shows that your proposal would produce $300 million. Of that $300 million, what proportion would go to New York City Transit?
I do not know precisely. The largest portion of it would, obviously, but in connection with the statewide taxes, obviously there would have to be an appropriate allocation to the areas outside of New York City.
Under the most favorable of circumstances, could this emergency plan of yours come in time?
Well, with the monies that are available in the coffers of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which is under the jurisdiction of the MTA, which also has jurisdiction over the subways and the legal power to decide on the fare increase, and with the monies that would come from doubling the TBTA tolls, being as that money would come in immediately. This is a cash business, and the dollars flow in. You don't send a bill out and wait for the bill collector to get the money. And with prompt action by the legislature on these other measures, I think the 20-cent fare could be saved.
Mayor, since these proposals are all statewide, may we assume that the city has decided that it will not try to subsidize the fare and save it by itself in any way?
The city can't. We pour in massive subsidies now, and we face an operating deficit, as I pointed out, in excess of $700 million.
Dr. Rhodes said you can.
I'm not sure you're accurate on that.
He means legally.
Yes.
The mayor's talking about where the money comes
Correct.
from.
Not in the context that you put it. I don't think that's correct.
We repeat that, Mr. Mayor. You're saying now that in view of your budget gap deficit, that you do not have, you do not have any way of getting the money to subsidize the 20-cent fare after January 1. outside of these other proposals?
Well, as you know, the city puts in massive subsidies right now in the supply of free transportation for police and this kind of thing, school children. Very heavy and very expensive. And the city traditionally has done it all by itself, no help from anywhere else. That's utterly ridiculous. It obviously has to change. It can't go on.
Is the Keel plan then kind of an ultimatum?
Your plan is suggested as a very constructive way of helping mass transportation in general, whether
only equitable, but sound transportation policy to have the motorist help subsidize mass transportation, because the subsidy he is getting, the advantages that he has derived from the monies he receives for the privilege of driving to and from work in an automobile, is so out of proportion to the mass subway rider, to the detriment even of the motorist himself, that has to be corrected. This is not simply a revenue-raising approach. It is a policy approach to mass transportation in connection with which the pricing of the service that is received by the individual is brought into some better balance. It still far favors the motorist and will lead to the development of a sensible policy of transportation for this area.
Mr. Mayor, may we... Mr. Mayor, how do you think, from a practical point of view, we could get to the tri-state idea that Mr. Keel has proposed as one of his key points? We have the MTA, we have the Port Authority.
Well, what it really amounts to is an expansion of the MTA theory into a tri-state instead of a single-state status. This was indeed recommended by me 4 years ago when I first submitted the reorganization plan for transportation in Albany, which would have merged the separate authorities in this area into a coordinated system. And I also, at that time, stated that this should be put on a tri-state basis. As you know, my own program was shut down in Albany. And ultimately, a couple of years later, we emerged with something rather akin to it in the MTA. A moment ago, is a very severe problem. I believe in offering solutions to problems. This is a solution, and perhaps the governor or others have better solutions. I'd love to hear about them, but it is a constructive solution, and in the absence of any alternatives, why, of course, I would hope that it would receive his support in order to get the legislation through.
And this is proposed on the contention that it is now the state's responsibility to save the fare. Is that right, sir?
Well, it's proposed, you're oversimplifying. It's proposed on the basis, as stated by Mr. Keel, that mass transit is a public obligation. And transportation is now recognized to be a state obligation. The state of New York took over and is operating the subways under the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. The state has not hesitated to recommend various forms of subsidy for commuter riders on the Long Island Railroad and the other railroads. The same philosophy ought to apply here. And as Professor Vickery has pointed out, and in Ted Keel's statement, the imbalance that exists now between the mass transit rider and the automobile rider is enormous, because the automobile and the automobile rider is supported by massive subsidies, whereas the mass transit rider is not. Let me add also that we're getting into a very important and increasingly important area of the environment here. We're talking about a quality of life in a city. And I think it's increasingly recognized that one of the unpleasant pressures of big city life is the strangulation of the gasoline engine that pollutes the air, fouls the streets, and grinds at the nerves. The alternative to that is to provide a pollution-free transportation that does not require the use of the gasoline engine in central city areas. And as environment and the quality of life becomes the subject of increasing concern to all people in our country, here is one way to attack it. And I would put this strategy on the basis not only of serving mass transit and of keeping down the cost, the cost of a fare in mass transit. Also, I'd put it down as a very important step in the attack on an impure environment.
Mr. Lindsay, Dr. William Ronan, head of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, in his position as head of the MTA, has stated unequivocally that the only way to save the fare is a city subsidy. Is this program today your answer to that?
I don't think that he has said it just that way. I'm surprised that you say that because that is not my impression.
Mr. Mayor, is it true that in this gubernatorial year, that you would feel that the governor would have to support your demands for subsidy?
You're introducing politics into this.
Politics will play a very important part.
I wouldn't think of doing such a thing.
Comparing this, Mr. Mayor, yes. Comparing this to an earlier situation, last summer, the hospitals were threatened with major cutbacks in the city because there was an $84 million shortage, which you asked the state to supply, and the state didn't, which at the last minute the city found. Is it possible you'll locate money in the budget to save the 20-cent fare?
No, I've told you what where we are. The city supports mass transit by the only subsidy that exists.